The last of the boxes was inside. Ben slammed the truck's tailgate shut, the sound echoing once against the vast, silent face of the mountain before being swallowed whole. He took a deep breath. The air was different up here, thin and sharp and tasting of pine and cold stone. It was the air of freedom. Maya came out onto the porch, wiping her dusty hands on her jeans. She leaned against one of the thick wooden posts, a real smile on her face for the first time in months. The house stood behind her, a simple, solid structure of dark wood and river rock, nestled into the side of the mountain as if it had grown there. It was their escape pod, their fortress of solitude. The real estate agent, a man named Henderson with a cheap suit and sweat stains, had practically given it to them. "A real steal," he'd said, his eyes darting around nervously. "The previous owner, an old fella, just moved on. People up here, they like their space. You'll have all the space you need." He hadn't stayed for a drink. He'd shoved the keys into Ben's hand and his car had kicked up gravel, speeding down the long, winding driveway. The people in the small town at the base of the mountain, Havenwood, had been the same. When they'd stopped for gas and supplies, the cashier had looked at them with a strange, flat expression. It wasn't hostility. It was something closer to pity. Ben had dismissed it. City people buying a mountain house, they were probably just an amusement. Now, standing here in the profound quiet, he felt a surge of triumph. They had done it. They had escaped the noise, the rent, the constant grinding pressure of the city. He walked up the steps and put his arm around Maya. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "It's so quiet," she whispered, and it was a prayer. The house seemed to agree, settling around them, its old wood sighing in the late afternoon sun. They stepped inside, closing the heavy oak door behind them. The lock clicked shut with a sound of finality. Hope was a tangible thing in the dusty air. They were home. The first week was a flurry of unpacking and settling in. Ben, a carpenter by trade, was in his element. He moved through the house with a sense of purpose, checking the floorboards, testing the window frames, planning the shelves he would build. The house was solid, built with an old-world craftsmanship he admired. Thick oak beams spanned the ceiling. The stone fireplace was large enough to stand in. He felt a connection to the anonymous builder, a shared respect for wood and stone. Maya set up her pottery studio in a small sunroom at the back of the house, its large windows looking out directly into the dense, dark green of the forest. She loved the light, but more than that, she loved the silence. It was perfect for her work, a clean slate for her thoughts. But as the days bled into one another, the nature of that silence began to change. It stopped being peaceful. It started to become a presence. It was a physical weight, a pressure against their eardrums, a stillness so absolute that it made the sound of their own breathing seem like a violent intrusion. At night, the house made noises. Ben told himself it was normal. Old houses settle, wood expands and contracts. But these sounds were wrong. It wasn't the familiar groan of old timber. It was a dry, sharp click from the empty guest room upstairs. It was a faint scraping sound from inside the walls, like a slow trickle of sand. It was the sound of a house that was not settling but waking up. Maya felt it first. She was more attuned to the atmosphere of a place, her senses not dulled by the constant search for logical explanations. One afternoon, while sweeping the living room, she stopped. She stared down at the wide oak floorboards. The grain of the wood, the dark, swirling patterns, seemed to coalesce. For a fleeting second, she saw not patterns, but faces. Dozens of them, mouths open in silent screams, twisted in agony, trapped within the wood. She blinked, and they were gone, returned to simple wood grain. But she couldn't unsee it. There was a stain on the ceiling of their bedroom, a pale yellow discoloration left by some long-forgotten leak. She became obsessed with it. She was sure it was changing shape. Yesterday it had been a vague, cloud-like splotch. Today it seemed to have elongated, thinned out in the middle, like a microscopic amoeba slowly, deliberately moving across the plaster. There was a spot in the center of the main living area, a space about 5 feet in diameter, that was always cold. Ben could have a fire roaring in the hearth, sweat beading on his forehead, but if he stepped into that spot, the temperature would plummet. It was a pocket of deep, unnatural cold, a thermal dead zone that defied physics. "Something's wrong with this house, Ben," Maya said one evening, her voice low. She was staring at the cold spot on the floor. "It doesn't feel right. It feels watchful." Ben looked up from the table he was sanding. "It's an old house, Maya," he said, the same tired refrain. "The foundation is settling, that's the cold spot. The frame is drying out, that's the clicking. You're just not used to the quiet." He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. He had sunk every dollar they had into this place. It had to be perfect. He was a man of tools and measurements. He understood wood and weight and stress. He did not understand watchful silence or screaming faces in the floor. His dismissal, meant to be reassuring, only drove a small wedge between them. Maya stopped talking about it. But Ben saw her. He saw her tracing the patterns in the wood with her finger when she thought he wasn't looking. He saw her staring up at the ceiling stain for long minutes, her expression one of dread. She was becoming a stranger in their new home, and the silence she had once craved was now her tormentor. The second week began with the sky turning the color of a bruise. The weather forecast they'd checked before losing cell service had promised a week of clear autumn sun. But the mountain had its own weather. A wind began to whip through the pines, not a normal wind, but a high, keening moan. Then the snow started. It didn't fall in gentle flakes. It came down in thick, wet, heavy sheets, a solid wall of white that erased the world. Ben stood at the window, watching the landscape disappear. The driveway vanished. The trees became white ghosts. The world shrank until it was only the house itself, an island in a churning sea of white. By morning, they were buried. The snow was 4 feet deep, drifted up to the windowsills. They were trapped. "It's fine," Ben said, his voice a little too loud in the oppressive quiet. "We have enough firewood to last a month. Plenty of canned food. It'll be an adventure." He went to the basement to start the generator, a beast of a machine he had proudly installed himself. He pulled the cord. The engine sputtered, coughed out a puff of black smoke, and died. He tried again, and again. Nothing. The engine was seized, as if its metal parts had fused together overnight. A cold knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He went to the landline on the wall, the old rotary phone the previous owner had left. He picked up the receiver. There was no dial tone, only a dead, empty silence. The line was down. He tried his cell phone. No service. Of course, they were completely, utterly cut off. The house, now isolated from the world, began to assert itself more boldly. The game was over. The siege had begun. That afternoon, Ben closed the door to the spare bedroom, making sure he heard the latch click. An hour later, he walked past and saw it was wide open. He closed it again, this time pushing on it to make sure it was secure. He turned around, took 2 steps, and heard the soft click of the latch behind him as it opened itself. He tried to lock it. The key wouldn't turn in the old lock, as if the mechanism inside had been filled with concrete. The wind howled, rattling a window pane in the kitchen. Ben decided to board it up, just in case. He got his hammer and a handful of nails. He held a plank of wood against the frame and drove the first nail. Instead of sinking into the wood, the nail hit it with a sharp ping and bent in half, as if he had struck solid steel. He tried another spot. The same thing happened. The wood of the house, his area of expertise, was rejecting him, refusing to be altered. The food was the next to go. It happened with a supernatural speed. A loaf of bread he had just taken out of the pantry was covered in a thick, velvety green mold the next morning. A bowl of apples on the counter turned soft and brown, their flesh collapsing into a rotten mush in a matter of hours. Cans in the pantry, when he opened them, revealed not peaches or beans, but a foul-smelling, bubbling slime. The house was not just trapping them, it was starving them. It was slowly, methodically removing every tool, every comfort, every means of survival. It was digesting them. The third week descended, and with it, a new kind of decay. The hunger was a physical constant, a hollow ache that had become the baseline of their existence. But now the house's psychological warfare intensified. The yellow stain on the bedroom ceiling, Maya's quiet obsession, darkened. It shifted from a pale ochre to a deep, bruised brown, and then it began to drip. It was not the quick, light patter of a water leak. It was a slow, heavy, viscous drop. A single thick tear would form, hang for a long, pregnant moment, and then fall with a soft, obscene plip onto the wooden floor. Plip, plip, plip. The sound was an insidious metronome counting down their sanity in the crushing silence. Ben placed a ceramic bowl beneath it. The liquid that collected was not water. It was a thick, yellowish-brown fluid, the consistency of motor oil, and it carried a faint, sickly sweet smell. The smell of old flowers and rot. It was the smell of organic decay. For 2 days they listened to the sound. They watched the foul liquid slowly fill the bowl. For Ben it was the final violation. His logic, his understanding of the physical world could not explain this. A house did not bleed. He could not fix a house that bled. The maddening, rhythmic sound, the foul smell, the sheer wrongness of it all, broke through his carefully constructed dam of denial. He was a carpenter, a man of action. A problem existed, and he would solve it with force. He went to his toolbox and took out a heavy steel crowbar. "I'm finding the pipe," he said, his voice a low growl. "I don't care what I have to break." Maya didn't try to stop him. She just watched, her face a pale, hollow mask. He dragged a chair under the stain, climbed onto it, and swung the crowbar. The plaster exploded downwards in a shower of white dust and lath splinters. He swung again, tearing a bigger hole, grunting with the effort. He was attacking the house, fighting back with the only language he knew. He reached into the hole, expecting to feel the cold, hard curve of a copper pipe or the rough grain of a wooden beam. Instead, his fingers touched something soft, damp, and fibrous. He recoiled, his hand covered in a grayish slime. He tore a larger section of the ceiling away, revealing what lay beneath. It was not an attic. There were no beams, no insulation, no empty space. The cavity between the ceiling and the floorboards above was completely filled with a solid, grayish-white mass. It looked like countless layers of paper pulp or wet fungus, compressed under immense pressure. It was damp to the touch, and it seemed to thrum with a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, a life that was not life. And there, embedded in the center of the grotesque mass, was a book. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its dark brown cover perfectly preserved, untouched by the dampness and decay surrounding it. It was as if the house had been growing around it, protecting it. Ben reached in, his fingers sinking into the soft, yielding mass, and pulled the journal free. It felt heavy, solid, real. He and Maya sat on the edge of the bed, the dust from the ceiling still settling around them, and opened it. The ink was a faded brown, the handwriting a neat, controlled script. It belonged to the previous owner, a man named Elias Thorne. The first entries were filled with a quiet joy. September 14th. The silence is a balm. After the noise of the city, the stillness of this mountain is a gift. The house is strong, a good companion. Ben felt a chill. The words were almost identical to his own thoughts from a few weeks ago. They kept reading. The entries grew more sporadic. The tone began to change. October 3rd, a peculiar quiet today, not peaceful. It feels expectant. The house makes sounds at night. I tell myself it's just the wind, the settling of old wood, but the sounds are too precise. A click, a scrape. They do not sound random. Maya let out a small, choked gasp. She pointed a trembling finger at the page. Ben nodded, his jaw tight. Elias had heard it too. The entries became more frantic. October 22nd. I am no longer sure of what is real. I saw a face in the floorboards today. Just for a second, it was screaming. The cold spot in the living room is growing larger. I measured it. The house is changing, or I am. They turned the page. The handwriting was becoming more erratic, the letters larger, pressing hard into the paper. November 12th. The storm came. I'm trapped. The lines are dead. It does not want me to leave. I feel it now. It is a presence, a hunger. Not for food. It hungers for stillness. It feeds on sound, on movement, on thought. It wants me to join its silence. It wants me to become still. The last few pages were almost illegible. Then they reached the final entry. It was not dated. The page was filled with a single word written over and over again, the script devolving from legible letters into a frantic, angry scrawl of intersecting lines, the pen having torn through the paper in places. They closed the book. The air in the room was cold and dead. There was no more doubt. They were not going crazy. The journal was not a story. It was a prophecy, a blueprint for their own destruction, and they were already halfway through it. The discovery of the journal broke the last of Maya's defenses. Her mind, already frayed, simply snapped. She retreated into a world of her own, a world that sought to appease the house's terrible hunger. She stopped speaking. The silence she had once feared, she now embraced as a form of worship. She would sit for hours on the floor in the cold spot in the living room, her body perfectly still, her fingers tracing slow, endless circles on the wood. She refused to eat what little food they had left. "It's too loud," she would whisper if Ben tried to force a piece of cracker into her hand. "The chewing, it's too loud." Her withdrawal had a strange, terrifying effect on the house. Ben noticed it almost immediately. When Maya was in her silent, motionless state, the house seemed to calm down. The strange clicks and scrapes from within the walls subsided. The oppressive, watchful pressure in the air seemed to lessen. It was as if her stillness was placating the entity, feeding it a small portion of what it craved. Ben, his own mind warped by starvation and terror, began to see a pattern. A terrible, insane logic started to form. The house wasn't just trying to kill them, it was trying to convert them. He looked at Maya, a still silent figure in the gloom, and saw not his wife but a conduit, a lightning rod for the house's will. He remembered the journal. Elias, driven mad, wanting to become still. He looked at Maya and believed he was watching her suffer the same fate, being slowly, spiritually digested while she was still alive. He became convinced that her quiet suffering was the source of the house's remaining agitation. The only way to save her, the only way to truly appease the house and perhaps earn his own survival, was to give it what it wanted. To grant her the absolute, perfect stillness it craved. The act, when it came, was not born of anger or panic. It was a cold, methodical decision, the final step in a twisted logical proof. He waited until night fell, until Maya had finally curled up on the floor in the cold spot, asleep or in a state close to it. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers. He moved with a dreamlike slowness. He went to their unmade bed and took one of the heavy pillows. He walked back to where she lay. He knelt beside her, his movements silent on the wooden floor. Her breathing was shallow, a faint whisper in the dark. "It's okay, Maya," he whispered, though she could not hear him. "We'll be still now." He placed the pillow over her face. He did not slam it down. He pressed it firmly, evenly, putting the weight of his upper body into it. There was a brief, muffled thrashing beneath him, a weak, frantic kicking of legs. He held it firm, his face a blank mask, his eyes staring into the darkness. He felt the last, shuddering convulsion run through her body. And then, nothing. He held the pillow there for a full minute after, to be certain. Then he removed it. He looked down at her face, peaceful in the firelight. The terrible stillness he had created was profound. It filled the room, it filled the house. And the house, in return, seemed to sigh in satisfaction. The moment Maya's last breath left her body, the change was instantaneous and absolute. The oppressive pressure that had been squeezing the air out of the rooms for weeks simply vanished. The cold spot on the living room floor where her body lay began to warm, the chill receding like a phantom tide. For the first time since the storm had hit, Ben could hear the normal, natural sound of wind whistling around the eaves of the house. It was just wind, nothing more. The house was sated. His sacrifice had worked. He spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair, watching her body, a sense of profound and terrifying peace settling over him. He was not a monster. He was a survivor. He had understood the rules of the house, and he had made the necessary move. When dawn broke, it brought with it another miracle. The snow, which had entombed them for weeks, was melting at an impossible rate. It wasn't just melting, it was receding, evaporating into the crisp morning air. By mid-morning, the long driveway was clear. A path to the outside world to escape was open. Ben stood on the porch, the cold air biting at his face. He could leave. He could walk down that driveway, get to the town, tell them some story about the storm, about Maya having an accident. He could return to the world of noise and people and questions. His final confrontation was not with a bear or a ghost. It was with the open road. He looked back into the house. He saw Maya's body lying on the floor, strangely serene. He looked at the quiet rooms, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. The house was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary. It was silent. He felt no hunger. He felt no fear. He felt no need to leave. He walked back inside and closed the heavy oak door. He dragged one of the dining chairs into the living room and placed it near her body. He sat down. He looked out the large window at the silent, snow-covered mountain, and he stopped moving. He just sat, perfectly still, as the sun arced across the sky and the light began to fade. He did not move to eat. He did not move to sleep. He had finally learned the house's language. He had become part of its collection, another quiet object in its endless, patient stillness.